China 15 years ago, looking at its own demographics, determined that it wanted to essentially annex the young people of the global south, particularly in Asia, Latin America, where you have a reasonably disciplined workforce and the ability to introduce infrastructure, and make them part of the Chinese economy. They've accomplished that. The chief technology officer of Huawei told me in an interview a year ago, you don't understand the Chinese. The guy's an Australian. That if we have a problem, we'll put 1,000 engineers on it. And if that doesn't do it, we'll put 10,000 engineers on it. Chinese have produced videos showing plants that produce 1,000 cruise missile motors a day. And we know from the Pentagon estimates, they have several thousand satellite-guided long-range or medium-range, that's 1,000 miles or more, surface-to-ship missiles, which means that anything sitting on the surface of the ocean is basically a sitting duck now.
大家好，今天要分享的是美国知名的战略分析师、经济学家大卫·戈德曼一段谈话的节选。戈德曼自称老里根鹰派，但他并不像一个典型的左派或右派评论员。他的分析根植于对历史、文明、宗教和人口结构的长期观察，擅长于从文明兴衰的宏观视角来审视当代的国际竞争。这段谈话是他在去年参加美国昆西研究所主办的一场主题为“美国繁荣”的讨论会上的发言。讨论会聚焦中美关系，探讨应对与中国竞争的最佳策略。一些人主张对中国采取更激进的立场，而另一些人则主张采取更审慎的态度，与中国保持可持续的联系。戈德曼建议美国应该更多地向内看，专注于解决国内问题，重建工业基础，加大科技研发投入，而不是试图通过围堵来改变一个他无法改变的中国。我们来看看他是怎么说的。
David, you wrote a book in 2019 entitled You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. You say they want to have everybody in the world pay rent to the Chinese empire. You said in an interview when your book came out, they want to control the key technologies, the finance, the logistics, and make everyone dependent on them. Basically make everyone else a tenant farmer. America is on track to become poor, dependent, and vulnerable unless we revive the American genius for innovation. What do you think about what Sagar just said, the problems that he invoked, and do you still believe that way? You wrote the book before some major events in the world, COVID, the wars abroad.
The biggest single economic fact in the world is a globally aging population and a rapidly aging population in the industrial world. And it will be rapidly aging in India, Latin America, and elsewhere. The scarcest resource in the world is young people who can read a manual and get trained and work in a factory. China 15 years ago, looking at its own demographics, determined that it wanted to essentially annex the young people of the global south, particularly in Asia, Latin America, where you have a reasonably disciplined workforce and the ability to introduce infrastructure, and make them part of the Chinese economy. They've accomplished that. They did that first by using digital broadband infrastructure as the thin end of the wedge. That's Huawei and ZTE, which are the dominant players in telecom infrastructure, particularly in the global south. They did that through the Belt and Road Initiative, which built a lot of physical infrastructure. There have been many failures in that project, and the American press tends to play up the failure, debt trap, diplomacy, cathedrals in the desert, and so forth. But during the past 10 years, there's been virtually no change in Chinese exports to developed markets, US, Japan, Europe, Australia. But in the last 5 years, their exports to the global south have doubled. And that's an astonishingly big achievement. Now, a lot of the exports that they do to the global south are re-exported to the US. We put tariffs on Chinese goods, but Chinese build plants in Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, and so forth, sell components and capital goods to these countries, and we buy from them. So despite the best efforts of Donald Trump, who is completely sincere in his concern about this, we are more dependent on Chinese imports and more globalized now than ever before. And the key to this, the key to solving this is rebuilding American industry, seizing the heights, getting the high tech. But that's exactly what the Chinese set out to do. You look at their subsidies, they're very targeted. First, they got solar panels. Secondly, electric vehicles, where they're certainly the dominant player right now. They're working on low-end semiconductors, and they'll use that as a springboard for high-end semiconductors. And the Chinese have probably, and of course telecom infrastructure, the Chinese have done more in terms of applications of AI to manufacturing than we did. One of the insane things about destroying a manufacturing base is if you don't have it, you can't innovate with it because you don't have the people to do the innovation. So I think the key to all of this is a domestic industrial policy. I don't mean necessarily handing out checks to every industry that knocks on the door. That's just rent seeking. But a policy that trains workers, trains engineers, makes capital available to invest, private investors who are willing to take risks on goods production, and aggressively seeks to innovate our way out of this mess. There's a lot to be said about that. I wrote a little book about that for Claremont, which is available on their website free. But at this point, we can't, we tried to slam the door on some Chinese exports that just came in the window, as I mentioned, through third countries. And that puts us definitely on a back foot. And the solution is to give American workers the tools and the skills to return to the kind of golden age of working class incomes that we had in the 50s and 60s. There's an old joke about the Austro-Hungarian Empire that it was a tyranny tempered by incompetence. And I think the same can be said about American technology policy towards China. We certainly impose serious costs on China, but when President Trump, I believe in April of 2019, put a ban on higher-end chips to Huawei, most American analysts said that will finish off China's 5G program. They won't be able to roll it out without the higher-end chips. Well, 6 years later, China has 3.8 million 5G base stations, and we have 100,000. And their 5G is real 5G. It's about 3 or 4 times as fast as ours. And that's having a big effect in their industry. They've managed to work around it with lower-end chips. Huawei virtually shut down its handset business because you need the faster chips to run 5G. But then last September, they demonstrated that they could produce domestically with the technology they had higher-end chips that were good enough to run a 5G smartphone, and they could kick the stuffing out of Apple in the Chinese market. So we have not really stopped the Chinese from proceeding with their plan. We've imposed substantial costs on them. My guess is maybe even 0.5% of GDP per year. It's a big cost, but they're willing to pay it. The chief technology officer of Huawei told me in an interview a year ago, you don't understand the Chinese. The guy's an Australian. That if we have a problem, we'll put 1,000 engineers on it. And if that doesn't do it, we'll put 10,000 engineers on it. And China graduates more engineers than the whole rest of the world combined. So they've got a lot of them. So whenever you put a specific problem in front of the Chinese, they'll attack it, and most of the time they'll solve it. Where we really shine, and the Chinese don't, is in the unknown unknowns, in innovation. It's the kind of maverick, eccentric, antinomian, problem with authority rebel that did most of the great innovations of the digital age in the United States. So I'm convinced that if we pick our spots and we put the resources behind innovation the way we used to during the Cold War, we'll leapfrog China in many areas. But it won't work to try to stay ahead of them or suppress them in every area. It's a matter of picking our spots and being excellent in really key areas. It's fine to say trade destroyed a lot of American jobs. There's no question about it. But to what extent is that process easily reversible? We've got 600,000 manufacturing jobs advertised right now, and about the same amount of construction jobs, skilled jobs. We can't fill them. We've got schools that don't teach kids basic math. My dad got his first job at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1941. He worked on the Marblehead after it got chewed up in the Leyte Gulf. And he got a good education in math at Brooklyn public schools. And he was qualified to start as a machinist apprentice. If you look at what you need to start as a machinist apprentice now, well, it's proficient trigonometry, for example, coordinate geometry. Fewer than a quarter of American high school kids are proficient in high school math. So a kid with good high school math can walk out of high school and get a $50,000 a year job right now. They're there, but we're not training these kids because we've destroyed our educational system. We are so dependent on imports, particularly for capital goods, that we're like a junkie who's so weakened that if you put him on cold turkey, you kill him. I'm not talking about just the cranes at ports. Virtually every switch, capacitor, piece of electrical equipment that goes into utilities comes from China right now. We just stopped making them. Do you want to hand out subsidies for people to make capacitors right now? So there's just situations where, fine, we accept the goods from China, and other places where we kick them out. I'm all for tariffs on autos, particularly EVs. Donald Trump's exactly right. It would be a bloodbath if we let the Chinese manufacturers dump stuff on us. But I also agree with Trump that allowing Chinese automakers to build plants in the United States and employ American workers is a good idea. So, unfortunately, the devil's in the details, and you have to, as I said, start with what's best for us, what's best for our people, and their compromises. You can't get rid of China altogether. It's just too big. That problem's metastasized. But you can do a great deal to reduce our dependency and to leapfrog them. And it'll take time and a lot of effort in a lot of different areas.
So, David, and I was going to ask you about this, and you wrote about it, that Donald Trump made a point in his March campaign rally to build electric car companies here in the U.S. During the speech, he vowed to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese car imports, either that were coming directly from the mainland or from intermediaries like Mexico. But then he added, if they want to build a plant in Michigan and Ohio and South Carolina, they can, using American workers, they can. They can't send Chinese workers over here, which they sometimes do. But if they want to do that, we're welcome, right? Question mark. And you mentioned you think that would be a good idea. My question, I guess, is that that there's been a myriad number of proposals, legislation at both the state and federal level to keep Chinese nationals from buying land here in the U.S. based on security reasons, not just trade and labor concerns. Can you talk about this conflation of economic and security threats and whether that conflation is hurting the ability to compete effectively with Beijing?
No Chinese company has thought about building an auto plant in the United States right now. The atmosphere is pretty poisonous. And I actually had a talk with the economics attaché of the Chinese embassy a couple of weeks ago. She said, well, what do you think we ought to do? I said, call up Donald Trump and say it's a great idea. You may or may not make money building auto plants here, but if you want to build goodwill for yourself and you think you can build good cars at a good price, why not? Take them up on it. The Chinese bought something like 0.2% of American farmland. There are these headlines, $4 billion of American farmland, or $2 billion, whatever it was. Farmland is worth trillions in the U.S., a tiny bit. So that's the last thing I'm worried about. I think we've got politicians who are terrified to take on the big issues because they're big issues, and if you're not scared, you're not paying attention. And they want to show quick and easy results. We zinged them, we zanged them, we got them there. And it's popular because people don't like the Chinese, maybe understandably, or maybe not, but that's a different issue. It's a popular thing to do. You have a lot of cheap successes touted by politicians in lieu of taking on the really difficult issues. Biggest issue, Senator Paul is exactly right. We're broke. $34 trillion worth of debt. How are we going to spend money on industrial subsidies when we're already broke? So that's a very good question. Back in 1983, when I was a very junior contract researcher for the National Security Council, Reagan was terrified we couldn't afford SDI. We hardly had any debt back then. And we concluded that high-tech research for SDI would pay for itself by civilian spin-offs, which of course it did. So these are tough issues, and I think there's a lot more smoke than fire, in short, to this farmland business. We don't like BYD or Geely Auto buying land for a plant. Let's just rent it to them. On the security situation, I'm probably a lot less worried than most people in the room about the possibility of a confrontation between the United States and China, simply because the industrial prowess which China has shown in EVs can also do things like mass manufacture cruise missiles. Chinese have produced videos showing plants that produce 1,000 cruise missile motors a day. And we know from the Pentagon estimates they have several thousand satellite-guided long-range or medium-range, that's 1,000 miles or more, surface-to-ship missiles, which means that anything sitting on the surface of the ocean is basically a sitting duck now. And they have an arbitrarily large number of cruise missiles, and they've got a home court advantage. A destroyer can easily intercept cruise missiles, but it can carry about 100 interceptors in its hold. The Chinese can shoot 100 interceptors at any arbitrary, 100 cruise missiles at any arbitrary ship they want. So I think the Pentagon knows very well that we're outgunned in the home theater of China, and they're not going to want to get into a confrontation of any kind. That's a perverse example of peace through strength. That's unfortunately Chinese strength. Regarding the negative consequences of sanctions, I agree with my colleagues here. This is the dumbest thing anyone did since Napoleon imposed the continental system against the British in the early 1800s. It completely backfired. It's easy, and I say this as an ex-banker, to finance trade in any currency you want. It's just expensive, cumbersome, and annoying. You could use UAE dirhams, Indonesian rupees, Chinese RMB, Russian rubles. And if you're excluded from the dollar banking system, people will go to the extra expense of doing it. Normally they wouldn't. The most important thing that we did with the Ukraine war was not just to force Russia into the arms of China, but to also force a great deal of European, particularly German industry into the arms of China, because the quadrupling of natural gas prices in Germany made BASF and other major chemical producers uneconomical, and it put a squeeze on the German auto sector. So 3 weeks ago, a dozen German CEOs, including the CEOs at BASF, Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes, frog-marched Chancellor Olaf Scholz to Beijing and announced billions of dollars of investments in China. There's a near integration of the German auto sector now with the Chinese auto industry. And BASF now has more employees in China than it does in Germany. So we've really created a monster here. I'm just stunned by the stupidity of the Biden administration. And unpacking that will take a great deal of effort if we ever get round to it. So
I guess I want to go back to the original theme is, can we compete with China in all the ways that you have just highlighted without pushing this security dilemma?
If we were going to a 1940 situation, like with Japan, where we actually boycotted, in 1941, we boycotted oil for Japan, that would shut down the Japanese economy. We basically forced them to put them in a position where they had to respond. That would be the equivalent of cutting off all chip technologies to China, every one of the different parts of chip manufacturing, all the chip software, not just the higher end stuff. We've given them enough wiggle room to work around, so it's not worth their going to the mattresses over it. I think this is a very ill-conceived policy. Machiavelli said, if you hurt somebody, better hurt them enough so they can't come back at you. And all we've done with China is hurt them enough so they're really annoyed, and it's cost them a lot, and they're going to look for ways to make trouble for us for time immemorial. It's just a dumb thing to do, but it does not push them into, that by itself doesn't push them towards military action. That would be Taiwan or something like that.
在中美竞争的问题上，戈德曼与目前华盛顿的主流鹰派论调不一样。他多次批评美国政策制定者和战略界严重低估了中国。他认为美国基于自身自由民主模式的优越感，无法理解中国独特的政治体制和文化韧性，因此常常做出像中国崩溃论这样的错误预测和像技术封锁这样的失败的战略决策。他认为通过贸易战、技术封锁就能阻止中国发展的想法是美国的一厢情愿。中国的经济体量、科技基础和内生增长动力使其具备了很强的抗压能力。戈德曼将科技竞争视为中美竞争的核心战场，他密切关注中国在 5G、人工智能、量子计算和航空航天等领域的发展。他认为美国在尖端科技领域的传统优势正在被中国快速追赶和侵蚀。技术封锁在短期内会给中国带来困难，但长期看会刺激中国加速实现技术自主。他认为美国应该放弃幻想，承认中国是一个强大且持久的竞争对手。戈德曼认同中美之间存在修昔底德陷阱式的结构性矛盾，对中美关系的前景感到悲观。他认为中美之间的竞争是结构性的、深层次的，是两种不同文明和治理模式之间的竞争，很难通过简单的谈判或政策调整来化解。他警告美国必须正视这一挑战，抓紧解决内部衰败的问题，如政治极化、社会分裂、基础教育落后、基础设施老化等等，否则中美竞争鹿死谁手还犹未可知。